Welcome everybody to the Dutch Closure Meetup number 138. This time I actually took note of the correct number so I don't make a fool out of myself as usual. So that means 138 months, consecutive months of closure meetups in the Netherlands and since the COVID pandemic also on the interwebs. Tonight it's almost incredible. We do have a speaker on the agenda, so we do not have to improvise. I do not have to improvise and entertain you all for 1 or 2 hours. Davide from Nextjournal kindly agreed to join us tonight and speak about, well, Nextjournal. But I guess he is much more able than me to present himself and the talk he's gonna present to us. So, Davide, floor is yours.
You can see how it feels or how it will feel because it's still not live yet today in collaboration with this kind of nice tags as you see, but you can live collaborate and live edit a notebook with teammates and you see changes live. We stream changes using WebSocket, so it's pretty good system to collaborate interactively while writing notebooks. And then we have that code cells. So as the one you see here, these are two R code cells, so are the language code cells. They are linked to an environment, and an environment is a Docker image. In this case, it's the R Docker image. And when we run them, we create a runtime, which you can imagine like we start a Docker container, and the code runs in there. So to explicitly say what happens when you run an interactive notebook in Nextjournal, we schedule or activate an idle virtual machine. So we're based now on Google Cloud, but we also work on AWS. So essentially, one machine is for one notebook. Whenever you click run or you run a code cell, if it's already active and ready, you're going to continue working with that virtual machine. Otherwise, we spin up a new one. We will pull the relevant environments. We run the code inside the runtimes. And then we stream the results back to the client, and all the logs are appended in our content addressed storage. So also our logging is an append-only system. I hope you like notebooks because I'm going to speak a lot about notebooks, and I'm going to mention notebooks, I think, 1,000 times in the next few slides because another title of this talk is maybe Notebookception because, well, you'll see. Nextjournal is built using notebooks all the way down, and runtimes of code cells can be used as environment for other code cells. And if you make changes, so imagine you have a bash code cell that is downloading some binary, you will have the file system or the runtime or the Docker container, it's changed, and you can decide to export that as a new Docker container, as a new Docker image, sorry. And then this can be used in another notebook. So that's actually how we work. Our environments are built like Docker containers with layers. So it's notebooks all the way down, and I can show you. So if Nextjournal works fine, which should, even if no demo occurs now. So this is an interactive notebook. So this is the UI of Nextjournal. This is an interactive notebook I made, well, more than a year ago when COVID started, like to make some data analysis of what happens in Italy. And there are a bunch of code cells. And some is bash, and the vast majority is closure. So I'm just manipulating the data. You see outputs, graphs, but this is not what I want to talk about. At the bottom, you see the runtime that I'm using, and it's a closure runtime. So if I click here, it opens the notebook it's based from, and this is the closure environment, which it's a notebook with literate programming. We have actually documentation and code intermixed. And in this case, we are in this notebook just talking a little bit about Clojure, showing some things, installing some libraries, show how you do plots. But when this notebook is run, the output is something that can be used to build upon. But now let's go back and let's go back from the source. So this Clojure, I go again to the bottom. This Clojure environment that I'm using is based on the GraalVM environment. Then the GraalVM environment is based on the minimal Python tree. And well, you can imagine where I'm going. It's going to end pretty soon, but the minimal Python tree is based on Bash. And then I think we basically reached the top, because Bash is based on, well, minimal Bash, which is based on Ubuntu based, which is the official Docker image of Ubuntu. So all our notebooks, all our environments, everything is essentially starts from here. So this is the root notebook, if you will. And you can, and this is very powerful, because then you can make a notebook which does some processing, and then you can export that and use that in another notebook, and it's going to not affect at all the original notebook. So you can build parts of your code base, or, well, in general, more of your logic inside notebooks based on other notebooks. And this allows pretty nice incremental computation. But then let's get to the topic of the talk, which is composability. This is a quote from Richiki. And at Nextjournal, we try really to focus into designing for this composability, which means trying to figure out which fundamental parts of our system can be identified, and if we can repurpose them for other purposes, for other interesting things. So, for example, in Nextjournal, the core parts that I talked about are like the editor, like the live editing environment. So, for example, part of this is the Clojure mode library that we released, which used code mirror, and it's parsing and basically makes editing using code mirror Clojure code pretty nice. Then we have the scheduler, which is the one that you can imagine organizes the execution of code, creates or spawns the machine when it's needed. This is mostly about organization. And then it's the actual runner, which is the small application that runs on the virtual machine that receives all the instruction and which physically, runs the code. And we are doing this because we are big fans of dog fooding. We are lucky that Nextjournal is not just for data science, because we don't do a lot of data science ourselves, but we do write code. And as I told you, Nextjournal can also be seen as a general platform for computing. And we believe in dog fooding, which means we try to use Nextjournal as much as possible. And in a sense, we are our first and most important customer. And the point is that if we are not happy, or we are frustrated or about using our product, it's useless that we go out and try to sell it to others. Like, we are paid to make it, we're paid to use it, and if we don't like it enough, we don't love it actually, how can we expect others to love it? So this is the first example of how we are dog food in Nextjournal, and it's Nextjournal CI. I talked a bit already about this in a blog post, maybe some of you have read, but I'm going to explain to you how it works tonight. So in our code base, we have a hidden file inside the Nextjournal config.hidden, which has this part. It's a map, and you can see here there are a bunch of Nextjournal notebooks referenced with a change ID. And this is important because change ID means these notebooks are immutable. Like, a colleague of mine could go and change the CI Clojure test notebook, but it doesn't matter. My tests are not going to change because, well, it's a fixed snapshot. So in here, you can imagine, like, making again the comparison with Git. The notebook is almost like the name of the repository, and this is like the SHA. But contrary to Git repository, I don't think there is a way to force push, which is better. because the whole point is about reproducibility. Like if you can change history, then we cannot guarantee that you will be able to reproduce the same results later on. And well, one of these notebooks, which I actually want to show you first I'm going to say how it works in Nextjournal CI before I show you. So we push a commit to GitHub, like normal CI. We have a webhook in our Nextjournal application, which gets the SHA from GitHub. Then the application itself downloads the code from GitHub and looks at these config.eden files, parses it, and figures out which notebooks are used need to be used for CI. Then we remix and we run these notebooks. Each of these notebooks does the following: clones the repository at the given SHA, tells GitHub, okay, I started my CI task, then runs it, and it can take several minutes. Then at the end, it will tell GitHub, okay, I passed if every code cell succeeded, or it will say, no, I failed if there is any failure in any of the previous code cells. And potentially, we also do more things. So for example, for our front end, we build our front end, and after the build is done, we do the shadow CLJS report, which is not critical. It's nice to have it, but even if it builds, the CI job has succeeded, so we don't need to wait for the report to be built. And I'll show you now how it looks, one of them. So this notebook is doing CLJ Condo on our code base. So actually, CLJ Condo is, I think, a great example of dog fooding. I'm not sure if Michiel is here tonight, but I hope he sees this video. So you can see at the top here, we have a GitHub component, which this is the SHA that it's supposed to test, pulls the code. Then we tell GitHub, okay, we started the CI. Then I actually download the repository also at master, because I'm not using CLJ Condo as a binary, but I'm using its API because I want to see what has changed, because our code base has quite some warnings and I don't want to fix them all at once. So at least we make sure that it doesn't get worse. And then at the end, this prints the results, and if there is a failure, throws an exception, so makes the code cell fail. And in the end, we report back to GitHub. But this is pretty nice, because now this is actually just a normal Nextjournal notebook. It's not something special. I mean, I made this normally using our CI. This is a normal code cell, a normal repository cell, code cell enclosure, deps.eden, more closure code cell. This is really just another notebook as per our application is concerned. And so I told you before the core parts of our product, right? So the editor, I use the editor because I can interactively build the CI notebook templates. And this is a big gain, because normally writing CI task is like very painful. You need to make a change, commit, take a look at CI, rinse and repeat. It can take an hour very easily. In here, it's a notebook runs, and it will happen in the same way all the time. So you can just interactively change it and run it. If it runs, if you're happy with it at least, then you should be happy with it also when you're running it against your repository. The scheduler schedules the remixes for running, and then the runner itself runs the test. So in this case, Nextjournal is, I use Nextjournal to make a notebook for the CI, which is then testing and building the application itself. So yeah, so we just needed to do it one time, and then we can keep building ourselves. There are still some ad hoc parts, but so the GitHub webhook and the fact of remixing. But I recently wrote some APIs that you can, post an HTTP call and then create a notebook or remix a notebook. So ideally, we could do this entirely with no ad hoc code. So maybe I'll get around to it. And then it will be completely self-sustaining. Another example of designing for composability is running notebooks on a schedule, which is different from scheduling, but this is more like a fixed schedule. So a customer some time ago contacted us because they do some periodic data analysis. So every day they run some reports, and they asked if we could provide them a way so they don't have to manually every evening run this Python or R data analysis report. So we built them running notebooks on a schedule. And I insisted a little bit, but I was able to get the cron also support for cron expression in, which was very good because now Nextjournal became a job scheduling platform. So you can schedule a notebook using a cron job. And since we can run bash cells, you can run a lot of code with that, as the crypto miners recently discovered. And this was very useful when we had the problems with our runners, and we had a problem with the certificate. So we couldn't schedule our runners. And we realized it only, we had some monitoring, but we realized it not early enough. So I built this notebook, which is, if it opens, my connection maybe is a bit tricky. So this is a notebook that runs every hour, if I'm not mistaken. Let me edit it. Yeah, every hour. And just a Clojure code cell that actually just pings Datadog. But if this code cell was able to run, means scheduling runners work. So we have a monitoring Datadog saying, if you haven't received this event in X amount of time, then something is wrong. And this is now a monitor, which is, or at least we are checking without any really custom code. If you disregard the pager message that we get from Datadog, this is using completely feature from our product. So that's, I think it's pretty nice. Another example is like using notebooks as REPLs for our application. And as Clojurists, we like a lot interacting with our code, and REPLs are amazing. We have a platform for running code. Why can't we use a notebook as a REPL to Nextjournal itself? And this is an example. So I made this notebook some time ago because some of the CI notebook runs were polluting our events log. These are machine generated, so they shouldn't show up in our event log. But essentially what this notebook does is connects to our Datomic. So this runs in a runner and has some special privileges. So only we, people from Nextjournal, can run this notebook clearly, or this kind of notebooks. So this connects to our Datomic. And then, for example, here I build a map for running a migration. And in the end, there is just a normal Datomic transact. So this is what we use a lot if we need to run some migration. This is what we need if we need to inspect our database. We don't have to, fire up a REPL, connect to our Datomic, and run some queries. We can have everything here. And if we use the other type of REPL that we have, which connects directly to Nextjournal, the application, we can reuse freely the code that we have in our application. We just require the namespace, and then we can run the normal code that we do. So we could change the code at runtime. And I think this actually we do in some cases. Not many, but we do. And then the last example that I want to tell you about using parts of Nextjournal inside Nextjournal itself is using notebooks as component. Like before, when I opened the notebook with CLJ Condo, there was I showed you the GitHub code cell, but that's just a UI trick. Actually, that when you have that GitHub code cell, it's actually pulling the content of this notebook, which is pulling itself a container with the necessary thing to connect to GitHub, or the credentials at least. And then this is just a bash code cell, which we should write in Babashka. But this is now doing the checkout, the resetting, and everything. So actually, when you run this notebook, it's automatically substituting the code for this GitHub component with the code that is in another notebook. So you can have even part of notebooks inside other notebooks. And this is the case for, well, the Docker and the Docker component that you saw and you can see here. And it's true also for example, for our S3 component. So we have some part of our code base which lies in other notebooks as well. And yeah, well, I talk a lot about notebooks. We use them a lot, and we want to use them almost everywhere. So because it's very nice to be able to run. Well, first of all, notebooks as a platform for literate programming is very useful, because then you can mix code and comments. And well, this is one way of approaching it. Another way of approaching it is, I think, what my colleague Martin showcased, the Clojure D, if you saw it, Clerk. So essentially, annotating Clojure namespaces, and the output is a notebook. But we do it in a more custom ad hoc way, but the essence is the same. And I showed you how we're using some components, or the same components, editor, scheduler, and the runner, to build a few different services, because we have the normal application, we have our CI, we have made our own monitoring, we have made cron jobs, so arbitrary cron jobs. And we are also looking at identifying further some of the components of our code base. Like at the beginning, I told you that logs, for example, are appended in our content addressed storage. Maybe that is a fundamental part that we can reuse in other places. Maybe we could make an immutable file system with that using the content address storage. Maybe we can use it for caching. And maybe we can use instead our editor, build some product that basically wraps our editor and then some logic, and then we are making an IDE, which doesn't have to be online, could be like a local first Clojure IDE, which is good for literate programming. And then we have, in general, we are trying to isolate more and more components so we can build more things. So the main takeaway from our experience is that we try to do architecturally the same thing that we do when we develop code. So when we develop normal Clojure code, we are trying, or general coding, you don't want to repeat yourself too much. You want to try and figure out the right abstraction so you can reuse this abstraction over and over. And is the same also architecture-wise. We are trying to figure out where are the main abstractions that we can take out, and possibly they can be used for other products, even down the line. Like when I arrived, I implemented Nextjournal CI using tools that were already there. That was not something crazy that I needed to make. Maybe only the code for the webhook, but everything else was already there. So we got the CI for free by careful design. And we are basically making our own toolkit. And it's good, because then you're like, we are experts and we make our own toolkits and we refine our own toolkits serving for a job. So actually we're also doing other projects, not just Nextjournal, and we are using the same tools, because if your abstractions are good and are general, and you are not also too ambitious in trying to make it too general, let's say, then they're useful in other projects. So we try to make pieces which are flexible enough that they can be used in different ways. Like, for example, the cron job, we try to make it not just very specific to the way you run notebook, but you could trigger and change them also using the API. And then you have another cron job as a service product. Well, we don't have that yet. We might have that, but it didn't cost us too much, for example, to add cron. It was just a matter of parsing some more strings, but the general functioning was the same. But now we enable the product to be used in different ways than we don't know yet. And but you need to be careful when you do this, because it's very easy to try and design a component which is too general, too abstract, and then it doesn't do anything. Like you need to also to be pragmatic, and it needs to solve a particular problem or be useful enough for a particular thing. Like our content address storage is not something crazy, but it's a storage that we can rely upon, and we can use it as a basis for anything that relies storage. So even the screenshots, for example, or even the assets of our code base, of our website, sorry, they are actually, we upload them in a notebook and we get their address from our CAS, and we use that in our code base. So we are now using the CAS also as a just general file repository for ourselves. And another point is like, depending on what is your line of business, because we are lucky that we are making tools for programmers or for people who are essentially programmers, because data engineers, data scientists, they're coding. We can make tools that we can use ourselves, like dog fooding. It's if you make an application, I don't know, if you are in the business of I don't know, computing payroll, then only only a very limited amount part of your company is going to be able to use the software to compute the payroll, because not everybody needs to do that. We're lucky that we are making developer tools, and we are all developers, so we can use our tools. And I can say that for us, the time we spent investing time to create tools, internal tools, or improve them and making them very useful for us was well spent, because again, closure mode was born out of a necessity for us to be able to show you the things that I did. Like before we had closure mode, writing closure in our application was much more painful. We had the parinfer support, which was not that polished. We didn't have paredit. I'm used to paredit, so it was very hard for me to write effective closure code. And after we built and open sourced, well, in general, this is a tool that can solve everybody's problem with CodeMirror, closure mode. Then writing closure in our code base, in our application, became much more, sparked much more joy. So we did it way more. So enabled us to do more things that before we were reluctant to do. And well, basically I said this before, like make sure you make a product that you love using it. Otherwise, you cannot expect others to love it. And I think that's it. So that's my talk. If you have questions, I'm here. And but yeah, if you want, you can sign up to Nextjournal. You can use it. We have a free plan. I have to say, a bit embarrassingly, currently we are under attack by crypto miners. So it's we disable temporarily running notebooks for new signups. But if you sign up to Nextjournal and you let me know the email that you used, I can use one of the notebooks or one of the notebooks that I showed you, one of the DevOps notebook that we use, to actually enable computation for you. So if that's the case, I can easily do it. It will take a second. I actually have it here open. But yeah, if you have questions, I'm here.
Any question from anybody?
Also later, I mean, no rush.
I have a question. Thanks for the talk, by the way. And it's nice to see you're building or using CLJ Condo in the notebooks. So you're mainly focusing on computing, but you're also building Nextjournal itself as a CI tool using notebooks. Would you consider going also in that direction as a company to build CI stuff that is interactive?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, if you're interested in using Nextjournal CI, we're happy to. I mean, now it requires a little bit more polishing because, I mean, the webhook, for example, is coded to our repository, but I don't think it will take a lot of work to make this into a product. So this is definitely something we talked about. So we are eager.
Yeah, so personally, not for work, but for open source, I would be interested in this. But especially for tools like, CLJ Condo, for example, I need access to not only Linux, but also Mac OS or Windows. So Do you have plans to support this? Because I don't think this is very useful in general for notebooks. So this might be a totally niche thing for you, right?
Yeah, no, true. We're now using only Linux machine because that's normally the use case we have for our normal notebooks. But we are just in a sense just using Google Cloud machines. I don't know. I think we can try to set up. I don't know if they offer macOS, but in principle, we can work with cloud providers, right? So as long as they have APIs, as long as they can run Docker.
Okay.
For sure.
And so I understand that GitHub also has ways to set up your own runners or on your other machines or something. So maybe you can also integrate it with GitHub.
Yeah, we are making our own solution for that. So right now you can only schedule notebooks on Google Cloud, but just even for normal use that some of our customers need, like imagine some of our customers are using on-prem stuff because their data cannot leave their network. So they will be eager to potentially also provide the runners themselves. So we are rewriting these codes so you can bring your own runner in the same way. So potentially then, yes. Anything.
So I broke the ice. Someone else can ask a question now.
Actually, I do have another question myself. So you made the example, the statement that you should try to avoid creating components which are too generic and don't actually solve an issue. Do you have an example off the top of your head of something you were trying to do and then realized, maybe not?
Not from top of my mind. I mean, I'm trying. No, I think we had the lack of start from components which were quite self-evident, like the editor, like pretty well defined. So their boundaries were not really up for discussion. So, but maybe I don't know. I will have to think about it a bit more, because some of our ideas, even let's say maybe the content address storage is good, but maybe the content address storage itself does not warrant as a standalone component, because maybe it can solve some problems, but maybe it requires some other things that make it more like access control. I don't know. Right now there is no access control. So clearly we need to build some more stuff around it. But the CAS is, well, it's not too generic, but it's, the boundaries for everything we built so far were clear. Going further, I expect us to have this problem more and more. Let's say like this. So I'll give an update in a year or two, and then I'll tell you.
Sure. Thanks. Anybody else? Because I do have more questions, and I just don't want to hog the interspace. Okay. So the Nextjournal, was it a Clojure project from the get-go?
No.
Or?
You can find online the talk that Martin gave. So the company has an interesting history. So we are completely bootstrapped, and they started, I didn't join. I only joined almost 2 years ago, but as an Elixir product. Then slowly they introduced Datomic, then ClojureScript, then they liked it, and they wrote everything in Clojure.
Okay.
So some of the patterns we have in our code base also are quite Erlang-ish, like with the message passing, but with chorusing. But now everything is purely Clojure and Bash, but we are rewriting a lot of it in Babashka. So Michiel will be happy. Like, we are very big customer of you.
Yeah, I also find myself writing more and more Babashka as we go. It's just easier. So I would imagine most of your customer base is actually using your product for Python-related things, I assume.
Yeah, Python, and some are using Clojure itself. So there are somebody who does data analysis using Clojure, like libpython CLJ, some of that, somebody in that space. But yeah, the vast majority of Python. We also have a few classes like Agda. We have Haskell because we are polyglot. So right now, Clojure. Well, we are a big customer of ourselves, so we also write a lot of Clojure. We run a lot of Clojure in Nextjournal, but I can remember now people using Python, R, Julia, Haskell, Agda. Some people trying APL, Dialog APL. So
And
also
do you need to
exoteric
do
languages.
do you need to do anything on your end to support a new language or not?
We need to make sure the environment work well. We need to make sure the protocol for interacting work well. So for the majority of these things, we use Jupyter kernels. So a lot of the job is done for us. But for example, for Clojure, we connect directly with the prepo. So the prepo, it's custom made. And for some things, potentially, if the Jupyter kernel does not exist, we need to figure out a way to interact, to send, to have a REPL-like kind of interaction. So there are more, but there are a lot of Jupyter kernels around. Some of them are more polished, like, for example, the Haskell Jupyter kernels, we have a lot of problem because it doesn't terminate so well. So we have a lot of runners that don't go down because they look like active, but there's nothing going on. So some of them are...
It's probably compiling.
Yes, it probably thinks it's still compiling or type checking.
Cool, thanks. It would be actually nice to see some statistics at some point of how your customers are using Nextjournal, at least what platform they're using, and etc.
Yeah, I think I don't have it in front of my mind, but it would be cool to publish it. We should.
All right. Do we have any more questions for Davide?
No question, but thank you for the presentation, David.
You're welcome.